Hello, everyone. My name is Lionel Sandner from Pembroke Publishers, and thanks for joining us today. Just before we get started, I would like you to know that Pembroke Publishers' head office is situated upon traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of Scugog, Hiawatha First Nation, Alderville First Nation, and the Métis Nation. The treaty covering this area of land in Toronto, Ontario is collectively known as the Williams Treaties of 1923. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Wasanich people on whose traditional territory I live, work, and learn. The Wasanich people have lived and worked on this land since time immemorial. And I wish to recognize the significant contributions of Indigenous peoples across this land. We seek a new relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, one based in honor and deep respect. And thanks for joining us this evening or this afternoon, wherever you are from our country. It's great to have you here this evening. Just before we get started, I will remind you that the chat is moderated. So as during the presentation, if there's a thought or a question you'd like to put in there, I'll be keeping track of that and bringing those questions forward at the end, as we've left a little bit of time to have just a short conversation to cover any of those questions that come up. We also have an offer at the end and a lucky draw for one person to get a ebook copy of Karen's book that she's talking about today around literacy, leadership matters. And so just before I pass the virtual mic over, I would just like to introduce to everyone Karen Filewych. She has more than 20 years of educational experience as an elementary teacher, school administrator, and a language arts consultant. She completed her Master's of Education degree in 2007 in the area of literacy, and has sort of taken that education and wrapped around writing, teaching, and presenting workshops across the country to teachers in the area of literacy. Her website, Words Change Worlds, highlights the power of words and provides teachers with regular book reviews and teaching ideas. She's also lives in Edmonton, Alberta, and we were going to put in the poll who's going to win the Stanley Cup based on that. So I do think it might be Edmonton's time for that. So with that, I will pass the virtual mic over to you, Karen, and welcome.
Thank you, Lionel. Yes, that's a good note to pass the mic along. We do hope from our perspective here in Edmonton that it's our time. I do thank you for joining me this evening. I know that you are so busy, and for you to come on a Thursday night and devote your time is much appreciated. Just a little bit to add, I have Lionel has already introduced me to some extent, but just to let you know that I really do believe in the power of words. You can see within all my roles, that is something that has really stayed with me, the power of literacy. I began writing for Pembroke with these two books on the teaching of writing, and this is my third book with Pembroke that we're going to focus on today. I'm actually very excited also because I've started to do some more writing now for children. So these are Bug Club decodable books that I've written as well, and I'm passionate about really making literacy accessible to both teachers and students. If you're interested, please feel free to follow me on social media. They're not personal accounts, they're always targeting education and literacy, so if you're interested, I welcome you to join me. Now, when we think about why we are here, why you are giving up an hour of your evening today, you acknowledge that leadership matters. Whatever your role happens to be, that is something that you acknowledge if you are here today. Also acknowledging that literacy matters. And when we bring those two together, we really think about the importance, especially in our elementary schools, but not only in our elementary schools, the value of literacy leadership and how much that makes a difference when it comes down to its student learning. So that's what our premise is today. And I want you to begin by thinking about your own school goals, whether that be something written, something formal that you have to submit to your district, or it might be something unwritten, something very informal. But thinking about these questions. What do you want your students to know? What do you want them to be able to do when they leave your school? What do parents care most about in regards to their children's elementary education in particular? And I would venture to guess that literacy was at least one of those answers, or factored in to at least one of those answers. You know, when we think about, you know, what underpins everything we do, it is literacy. Now, here's the thing. For those of us who are in elementary schools, that doesn't necessarily mean our training is in an elementary school. So when we think about, you know, our training for education, did we have any courses on literacy instruction? And if we consider the students coming out of post-secondary now and coming into our classrooms, many of them don't have on literacy instruction, even if they are an elementary focused student, which is a scary thought, to be quite honest, right? But think about yourself. Have you yourself had any teaching experience in kindergarten, grade 1, those other elementary grades? One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I was encountering so many administrators who found themselves in those elementary schools without this experience. When we look at the terms that I've just put on the screen there, and you see the phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, morphology, orthographic mapping, fluency, reading comprehension, when we see those terms, are those things that we're familiar with? Or is that, you know, a scary venture for us? We look at that and think, well, how can I be a leader in these things if I can't even identify what they are or know how to look for them within my classrooms? So when we're thinking about any of this instruction and any of this leadership in these areas, what we have to think about is where our own background lies and moving from there. So when we're thinking about supporting our teachers, right? We do need to understand the challenges and demands that they are facing. And for so many of our elementary teachers, those terms that you saw on the previous screen, that is what they are expected to be teaching. And we have to gauge whether or not they're familiar with those terms, whether or not they're familiar with how to teach each of those concepts, and how we can support them in doing that. If our experience as leaders lies outside of elementary classroom experience, that becomes even more challenging. So when we think about language and literacy, they really do underpin everything that we're doing. Now, if you consider the elementary setting for a moment, first of all, the students are learning the foundation for these very complex skills, such as reading and writing. On the other hand, we have to remember that they are using language in order to learn these skills. We use language to think, to communicate, and to learn. And if we were in the room together and I were to ask you what we use language for, the default is often for communicating. People often default to that function of language. And yet we have to recognize that our students, as well as ourselves, we think and learn through language as well. So it's really this double-edged sword that we're talking about. We're learning these skills, but we're also using these skills to learn. Now, when we think about our instruction beyond elementary school, we have people in the room who are not in an elementary school, but are leaders at other levels. Literacy instruction is still extremely important at that level. And what we have to realize is how do we support our teachers and therefore our students with that literacy instruction in the environment that we're in, especially if literacy isn't our own background. Now, when we think about the importance of literacy, one of the things I always talk about with teachers is how the skills that our students are learning within language arts are going to empower them as they move through their education and much beyond that, right? These are skills that they are using every day of their lives. And I share that with students. I encourage teachers to have those conversations with students. I was doing a writing residency the last 2 days at a rural school here in Alberta. And one of the things that I was talking about with students is exactly that. You know, here we are, we're learning how to become better writers. And even if you're not going to be an author when you're older, guess what? You are going to need to know how how to write, you are going to use writing in some way, whatever your career happens to be. So really thinking about how we can set the stage for our students in that way. And if we're a leader, how we can encourage our teachers to do that. Now, when we look at this quote here, the limits of your language are the limits of your world, there's so much truth to that. And I want you to know that that's going to be underlying everything we talk about going forward today. Now, when we understand the importance then of literacy instruction, as leaders, we have to think about what specifically can we do to support our teachers. And Sir Ken Robinson, who I had the pleasure of meeting once, has said, "The gardener does not make a plant grow. The job of a gardener is to create optimal conditions." And when we think about what our roles are within our schools, we have to find ways to create these optimal conditions for our teachers. So we're going to look today, and we're not spending obviously a whole lot of time on them because we're only together for an hour, but we're going to just look at these things in a little bit of we'll discuss them a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from there. So first of all, we know how important it is to get to know our school. Now, there's many ways to do that, of course, but one of the best ways is through our instructional walks. And I know that when I was an administrator myself, one of my intents was always to build those relationships with students and teachers. And probably the best way of doing that was on my instructional walks. I was also, though, always looking for particular things, right? We want to know the routines and the practices, the strengths of our staff, the style that each of them have. And those are all things that we can pick up on when we're on the instructional walk. Now, one of the things that I realized very quickly is that the day gets away from us. We can have this wonderful to-do list, but as an administrator, as a literacy lead within your school, you know that your time is in demand and things come up constantly. I actually would schedule my instructional walks into the day, and I would always let the secretary know that this is when I'm going, so that I honored that. It was actually, she helped to hold me accountable for that, and also made sure that there weren't interruptions for that schedule, because I really felt that was important. And I also acknowledged that it was important to visit the classrooms at different times of the day. At the beginning, I would always go in the morning, and then I realized, well, I shouldn't do that because I'm not seeing everything maybe I need to see if I'm always going at the same time. So I really did try to vary it. Now, when we're thinking about the purpose, we really want our teachers to know that this is a positive, right? There was one teacher that I always think of on my instructional walks. Every single time I came in the room, he would stop teaching. And sometimes teachers would do that and they would have the class, say good morning or say good afternoon, but then they would continue on. But this one particular teacher that I'm thinking of would wait until I left before he would start teaching. And I think that was some insecurity there, right? So really making sure that the messaging to our staff, at the beginning of the year or before we do start doing instructional walks, they need to know our purpose, and we need to not be intimidating on those instructional walks as much as possible. Now, one of the things that I did within Literacy Leadership Matters is within each chapter of the book, so that you can see, this is just a little snapshot of what's within word study. What I included is instructional walk considerations. So when you're targeting a particular area, this will give you some things to look for. Now, this is an example from the oral language chapter. And you can see there's quite a few questions. So it's not necessarily that on your instructional walk, you're going to be looking for all of these things, but it certainly helps you to zero in on something. So the questions that I have circled there are all on questioning. So one day on that instructional walk, that's what we're focusing on, the types of questions teachers are asking, whether or not there's wait time, whether or not every student has the opportunity to answer. And each chapter sort of lays the foundation for the instructional walk considerations. So by the time you get to the end of the chapter and you see these, you have a good understanding of why they're important. The other thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about those instructional walks, is you can connect them to what you're talking about with teachers. So you're going to see a little bit later, we're going to have some ideas of staff meeting discussion, and feel free to connect those two together, so that if the conversation has been about word study and at your staff meeting, then that's something that you're also then paying attention to as you're doing your instructional walks. I always found that I was trying to focus in on something particular. Maybe at the beginning of the year, it was more general, but I really found them much more effective when I would look for something in particular. And sometimes I would, bring a little notebook around, and I would never take notes in front of the teacher, but I might not jot something down because lo and behold, by the time I got back to my office, I had forgotten some of the things I wanted to remember. So always keeping in mind, the purpose of our instructional walks is to find ways to support our teachers with student learning always at the forefront of our mind. Now, the other thing to consider is a literacy environment within your school. And again, it might seem like, well, yes, I do that. Of course I do that. But there's a few things that I want you to think about in maybe with new eyes, right? And sometimes it's just those reminders. We're so busy, we're caught up with budget, we're caught up for staffing for next year. We're thinking about all of these other things, but really taking the time to look at our school environment from the eyes of a student. So thinking about all these questions: are there nooks with books throughout your school? Are the books within student reach? Are there books on display so that the covers are visible instead of just the spines of the books, right? Do you change those book displays regularly? And when I say you, it might not be you specifically, it might be the royal you, but do you have someone in charge of changing those displays? What about child-friendly quotes around the building, right? All of these things help create a literacy environment. I just saw a picture, and I should have thought to include it. I just saw a picture where a school has created a mural, and they're all the spines of books, book titles, so everything from Harry Potter to Charlotte's Web, and it was really fantastic. And to me, I was thinking, well, what message does that send to our students, right? The fact that we value reading, we value literacy. And also thinking about, there's fun ways to incorporate that literacy environment. Thinking about favorite books of staff members. That's a great thing to do. And you can do that at different times of the year, right? But really thinking about, you can even make it a guessing activity for students, where you have the favorite book and maybe some clues, and the students have to guess which teacher has that favorite book. So there's lots of, obviously, ways to do that. And just thinking about, when you go around looking at your environment, look for accessibility for students. Look at the displays. Are there books, like we said, facing out, where it's not just the spine of the book? We want to invite the students in, and it really does make a difference. Something as simple as that. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side there, without those books at the top of the bookshelf, it's maybe less accessible to students. But as soon as we have those books facing out, we're engaging our students. When we're thinking about, creating those little nooks, also remember that doesn't just have to be in the library or the learning commons. We can do this throughout the school, and really being open. When we consider, I know books are expensive, and sometimes I've had people say to me, yeah, but they might get lost, or somebody might take them. You know what, as much as that could be a concern, sometimes I think maybe that student really needs that book. If that book happens to disappear, then maybe it disappeared to the right home. Also thinking about other ways to get literacy. Now, of course, I had to include something Euler here, but these are words we can read. And teachers are very creative at creating these displays, but also thinking about how we could do that on a school-wide level. So just ensuring that we create that literacy environment. The other suggestion that I love for administrators is think about you reading what your students are reading. As teachers, we tend to do that, right? We know that we're going to have those conversations with our students about books, but it's fantastic for administrators as well. So if you yourself have children or grandchildren, why not go into a classroom and ask for a book recommendation? Students get so excited when their administrator or the literacy lead within their school is asking them for recommendations. And then always make sure that you return the books if you've borrowed them, and then share your opinion. There are those kids who are reluctant to read, and they are they might just pick up that book if they know their principal, their assistant principal, whoever it is, has also read that book, right? So really thinking about how, as Donalyn Miller says here, she says, wear your reading love proudly. And I love that. I think that's really important. And whether or not we feel the same way about literacy as I do, I think that's something that we have to find ways to communicate the importance of literacy as a leader in the school. And it's especially in an elementary school, I would say, but I wouldn't stop there. I would make sure that we're doing it at whatever level we happen to be teaching. Now, the research is one of those things that I find many questions have been asked about recently. So I get questions from consultants, I get questions from administrators, I get questions from teachers, and it often lately has been coming down to the research. So a couple of things that we need to do is to try to keep on top of it, but can be really challenging. So not only are we thinking about what that research tells us, but we from there have to identify what should our teachers be doing, and do their current practices reflect that research or not? And sometimes the answer will be yes, and we also know sometimes the answer will be no. So one of the suggestions that I have, and I structured Literacy Leadership Matters to support you with this, is learning along with your staff. So each chapter, as I said, I alluded to before, you saw there was an oral language chapter, word study chapter. Obviously, there's one on reading and writing. It breaks down the different components, and then each of those allow for you to do some learning, but also to have those conversations with your staff. So I would actually, I think most teachers are happy when they hear an administrator say, you know what, I'm not sure I know everything about this. I'm going to learn along with you. And I think that can be really encouraging for teachers, rather than, someone pretending to know it all when we really don't know it all. And none of us do, right? I think acknowledging that is so important. So the other thing to recognize is that we can't do it all at once. So even though I have each chapter broken down the way that I do, you really have to be careful about doing too much too quickly, right? So I think better to do less, better to do less well, and then slowly over time, you can obviously add to that. Now, David Kilpatrick has said this: the findings from countless research studies have been consistent and clear. Students with good phonological awareness are in a great position to become good readers, while students with poor phonological awareness almost always struggle in reading. So that's one of the, such an important part of the research right now. And yet, if you're a literacy lead within your school, you're administrating your school, and you're saying, what's phonological awareness? That's normal. So many people are having those questions, but what we need to do then is figure out what we do about that. So we have to understand it. We have to figure out, are our teachers aware of this research? And does that research influence what they're doing within the classroom? So when we're thinking about phonological awareness, just one of the things that I wanted to point out to you, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just that it's an awareness that language is made up of sounds, right? That's a really easy way to think about what it is. And this is only a focus on oral language, not yet print. We'll bring print in a moment, right? And when we're thinking about some examples of phonological awareness, just as a little snapshot, if you're thinking, oh, I don't know if my teachers are doing this or not, it's the rhyme, the isolating beginning, middle, end sounds, the blending, and the segmenting. If you've heard your teachers doing that, that's a good sign, right? But we really want them to be intentional with this. When we're thinking about that phonological awareness, I posed questions. There's lots of questions in the books for you to think about, in the book for you to think about, but I wanted to share some of these with you here, right? So thinking about phonological awareness, we're going to see most of this in our K1 and 2 classrooms. That's not to say that it doesn't exist in the older classrooms, but that's where it's going to be primarily a focus. When you think about your struggling readers, that is often, David Kilpatrick's research shows that is often where they struggle with the phonological awareness piece. So if we can identify that, then we can support teachers with that. So when we're thinking about, the questions that you see on the screen there, we really want to make sure that the teaching of phonological awareness is intentional, it's explicit. We want to check, Do they have a resource to use? There are some districts that have bought something for everyone, at this level. But if we haven't had direction from our district, that might be something that we have to figure out. Okay, wait a minute, what do my teachers need if they don't have anything? And so this is the kind of thing that I've tried to support you with in Literacy Leadership Matters, right? And when we think about those instructional walks, I just wanted to give you an example of what you'd be listening for on that instructional walk, right? So you're checking, are my teachers using this language? Is this something that's happening? And this is another reason those instructional walks should happen at different times of the day. We have to make sure that we're not, only going at one time and then thinking, oh, it's not happening. Maybe it is. Maybe we're just not missing it, or maybe we're missing it. Now, from there, I just wanted to give you another quote here that is about now talking about phonics. So when you look at this quote here, it does show that socioeconomic background, all children, regardless of their socioeconomic background, benefit from the explicit and early teaching of phonics. That's what we're referring to here. So then we're thinking, what does that phonics instruction look like within my school, right? And is it consistent with teachers or not? Now, we know that phonics instruction is going to, this is where we bring print into the picture. So phonological awareness is only the oral language piece. Now we are going to bring in print. So sounds are represented by letters. And of course, we know this sounds obvious, but students need to know both the names of the letters and the sounds they make. Now, I think often, regardless of our background, this is often what we recognize that students need. And we might not know the intricacies of it, but we do know, oh yes, this is important, right? So really, teachers should be following a particular scope and sequence. And it actually doesn't matter. There's lots of different scope and sequences they can be using, but it is important that they're following one. It doesn't matter so much which one, as long as they're following one, because we want to be very intentional about the teaching of those skills. Phonics instruction is very cumulative, right? Makes sense. We're starting here and we're building. So that's another thing that you're watching for, and you're wondering, oh, are my teachers using a scope and sequence? Are my grade 1 and 2 teachers using, do they have, or if I have 2 grade 1 teachers, are they using the same scope and sequence, as an example, right? So we're also thinking about some of these questions here. Whether that instruction is explicit, intentional, systematic, that scope and sequence we mentioned, the resource to support the phonics instruction. Do they have one? What are they using? Is phonics instruction occurring every single day? In our primary classrooms, it needs to be. It is also important that it is occurring throughout the day. What we want to see is a grade 1 teacher who in social studies is reviewing or noticing or pointing out to our students, oh, there's the digraph SH, which we learned this morning. Let's read it together in context, right? We really want to make sure that our teachers are bringing that phonics instruction into the other subject areas as well. If we're thinking about our struggling readers, whatever grade they happen to be in, this is where we need to think about that phonological awareness and that phonics. That is likely where the gaps lie. Now, if you're doing your instructional walk, these are the things that you're looking for. And of course, this is going to be in your primary classrooms, right? We also want to see that students have opportunities to practice that phonics knowledge in context. When I was learning phonics in school as a student, I had a wonderful plaid workbook that was quite meaningless, and each page probably took only 6 or 7 seconds to complete, because I was just circling the particular digraph or whatever, or the blend on that matched the picture. It really wasn't meaningful or embedded within text. And so when you're walking around your classrooms, that's one of the things to look for. Is that phonics instruction? Do students have the opportunity, let's put it that way, do they have the opportunity to practice that phonics knowledge in the context of their reading and their writing? If your students do not have individual whiteboards in your primary classrooms, I really highly suggest that that's a tool that you look at purchasing for those teachers and those students. As a grade 1, 2, 3 teacher, I can't imagine not having one for every student, because we're going to be using them constantly within those classrooms. So that's something, well, there's a good way to win over your staff, right? Making sure that they have those available to them. Also, decodable books. Decodable books are, you'll hear more about decodable books than you will leveled books now. Decodable books will give our students the opportunity to practice their phonics knowledge in context without encountering all sorts of tricky words that are not easily decodable. So decodable books also follow a scope and sequence. So if we are focusing on the teaching of, short vowel sounds, then we can make sure that the books that our students are reading are going to be in line with where we are in the scope and sequence. So decodables within Alberta, actually, they have now entered, they are in our curriculum. They are in our language arts curriculum. And some of the other provinces are starting to mention them as well. But regardless of whether they're in the curriculum, they do help us practice our phonics knowledge in context. Now, when we're looking around the classrooms as well, you may notice what you see on the screen there as an Alconen box. That is something also that you want to make sure that your teachers have access to. They often use counters for that. So that's another thing that you might be looking for as you're walking around those primary classrooms. Now, long quote, I apologize, but I thought this was a really important one to share, especially with the direction that many of our provincial curriculums are heading. So for each word learned, there are more than 3 derived words with meaning recognizably related to that of the base, and at least 2 of these involve fairly transparent relationships. This demonstrates that the ability to utilize morphological relatedness among words puts a student at a distinct advantage in dealing with unfamiliar words. That's a mouthful. The basic concept that I want you to garner from this is the morphological relatedness. So when we're thinking about morphology, you're going to hear more and more about morphology. And I have a big project that I'm working on right now regarding morphology. So what we need to know is, okay, wait a minute, what is it? And are my teachers teaching it? And it is embedded within our curriculums in different ways. I've looked at the curriculums across the country and it's there in different ways. It's more explicit in some. I think it is going to become much more explicit as new curriculums evolve. So when we're thinking about what morphology is, just a quick little snapshot for you. A morpheme is the smallest unit of sound that holds meaning. So if you think about it in this way, bases, roots, prefixes, and suffixes, those are all considered morphemes, right? So when we teach morphology to our students, it's actually going to empower them to both readers and writers. It affects their word recognition, vocabulary, reading comprehension, fluency, spelling, and structural analysis. Why wouldn't we spend time on it, right? But so many teachers are not familiar with that term, as well as maybe us as administrators, right? So when we think about it, if we didn't have a delay, I would ask you this, but just in the interest of time, answer this for yourself. What do you think this student was trying to write? If you were a primary teacher, you've got it. So this student was trying to write the word added. Now, if we have taught morphology to our students, they are going to write the base element of add, and they are going to know to add the ed. If you look at the first version of added, it is phonetic. So not only is, phonetics are important, absolutely, but here you can see the importance of morphology, and you can see now how this is going to actually start affecting students in the higher grades. And so this is one example. I'll just give you another example. Consider these words here and think about how understanding the morphemes, those smallest unit of meaning, are going to influence their understanding of these words, their spelling of these words, their decoding of these words. The morphology piece, when we're explicit, is going to help with all of this. Now, when we look at roots, look at all the cross-curricular connections of these roots. So the quote that I showed you at the beginning, that crazy quote about morphological awareness there and relatedness. If our students understand, let's take an example, that fract means to break, they are going to have access to understand many more words, right? Not just one word that we might teach them, not just the word fraction, not just the word fracture, but you think about the refraction of light. Like there's so many things that we can capitalize on when we teach morphology. And so that's the intent with students. It is going to really open up. Like students are amazed when we say to them that, did you know that this prefix, and I wouldn't say it like this, but the prefix re holds meaning, right? Every time we see the prefix re, it means to do again. And if you look at, then study these words with the prefix re or with the root rupt. Did you know that rupt means to break or to burst? So if we think about eruption, we think about interrupt. There's so much that we can do with this. And like I said, I have a project I'm working on right now, so I could talk all day about this, but I won't. Morphology too needs that explicit teaching, modeling, and practice in context. So if we're thinking about that morphology in context in our classrooms, this is something that we're going to see only the beginnings of in grade 1 and 2. And I'll give you an example. It'll be what we call inflectional suffixes, often the ing, the ed, the plural, right? That's what we're going to see in morphology grade 1, 2 for the most part. And then as we get grade 3 and beyond, it's going to become more complex where we can talk more about those prefixes, the suffixes, and we can get into the roots. Those roots, the fantastic part about it, that's where we can see the cross-curricular connections, and so powerful for our students in their understanding of content level text. So I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to show you in terms of research, those are 3 just really basic examples, maybe not so basic, 3 examples of things that we might not know as literacy leaders within our school, the phonological awareness, the phonics, and the morphology. We might not know the intricacies of that. How can we support our teachers without knowing some of that information? So the book will support you with that if you're interested. Now, facilitating the conversations to me is extremely important as well, right? Now, one of the things that I recognized very, very quickly when I was an administrator is that teachers really do need to feel appreciated and respected, right? Because if we want them to be open about their practice, to take risks for us as administrators, they really do need to feel that they are trusted and respected. So really thinking about that kind of as the premise of what we're doing. Now, when we're thinking about those conversations about best practice, the quotes, for example, that I just shared with you, or any of the research that I refer to in the book, could be your starting point for discussion. And we always want to think about that strong pedagogy, right? So it's our goal through these conversations that we might save for 10 minutes at the end of a staff meeting, 20 minutes at the end of a staff meeting. I always, when I was an administrator part pair, we always tried to do anything that was informational through an email. If there wasn't need for a discussion about it, we wouldn't talk about it at a staff meeting. We tried to save the staff meeting time for things like this, right? So we could push the instruction forward, right? And so if you think about, setting aside that even 15, 20 minutes can make a big difference with the ultimate goal of small shifts in instructional practices, right? We can't expect to move mountains. We need to just take those baby steps where we can, and we can do that along with our teachers, right? So what do we talk about? Well, what I did is at the end of every chapter, right after your instructional walk considerations, we have then talk time. And those talk time, just to show you a couple of the examples, what I did is I included a line master for you. So this one is the oral language piece. And what you can see is that I often have started with some research, with a quote, something like that, that you can first discuss with your staff. And then there are a number of questions that you see follow. Now, if you're doing this with your staff, I would say don't feel the need to have all these questions. Even if you wanted to photocopy the line master and have it as on the tables for your teachers, you might highlight a couple of questions for this table, a couple of questions for this table. There's lots of ways to do that, but I wouldn't feel the need to use all of them. I just wanted to make sure that the right questions were being asked, if that makes sense. So another example, this is word study. Now, there's a lot in word study. In fact, all of the things that I talked about in the research section, that's all from word study. So you can see there's quite a number of, topics there. Again, no need to talk about it all in one day. Like, really zero in. What is it that you and your staff want to focus on, what you want to improve upon? And when you're thinking about, the example at the bottom there is spelling tests. Don't just jump into this with teachers without first reading the chapter. The chapter is going to give you the background knowledge to support that conversation as it comes up. I believe very strongly one way or the other about spelling tests, and I'll let you figure that out based on what we were just talking about. But so thinking about that, though, is making sure that you understand the research behind it, the pedagogy behind whatever it is that you're going to talk about, right, before you have that conversation with your staff. Now, training and resources is also something to really consider, because I have found that sometimes we go into a school, maybe we're new as the administrator coming in, or we're now, I've often also been in the position, maybe some of you have been in this position where you were a teacher in the school and all of a sudden you're now a literacy lead within the school. So your role has changed with your staff members. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that our teachers do have a range of experience and expertise. And sometimes when we're thinking about individual teachers, they may be insecure about teaching students to read and write. They find them, young teachers are going to take a job, whatever that job happens to be, and maybe they're not sure how to teach students how to read, how to write. And so we have to keep that in mind. We can't make the assumption that just because they're a grade 1 teacher that they have the necessary background and training. So really thinking about each individual within our staff. That's one of the reasons those instructional walks are important too, right? There are also teachers that you have on your staff that have those long-held beliefs about how they teach reading and writing in particular. That tends to be where a teacher is very passionate. You may have heard of the reading wars, right? And there's all this debate about which is the best way to teach reading. And so we're really now thinking about, okay, how can we use what the research is telling us to guide that instruction? If we have a teacher who has this long-held belief about I've done this for 30 years, so I'm going to continue doing this, you're not going to change that teacher overnight. That's why we said the small shifts in practice are so essential. Okay, so when we're thinking about bringing in something within our school, I'll give you an example. These are pictures of a sound wall. Sound walls, at least here in Alberta, have become much more common. Again, they actually were common previously, then they sort of fell out of favor for a while, and now they're very common again. Because I do writing residencies, I visit classrooms all the time. I'm in classrooms. I have had teachers share with me that they have no idea how to use a sound wall, but they have to have it up because their administrator told them to. I have had teachers share with me that, I started using it and then I've just sort of abandoned it. It's taking up valuable real estate in our classrooms, and it can be a very useful tool, but not if the teacher isn't comfortable with it. So if they need the training, we need to make sure they're getting that training we're supporting. Sound walls is just one little example, right? But it really could be for anything. Now, another thing to consider are the resources our students need when we're thinking about literacy in their classrooms. This is a little pet peeve of mine. I'm just looking at the time to make sure we're okay. This is a little pet peeve of mine, is when I see grade 1, 2 classrooms, maybe even grade 3 classrooms that students don't have an alphabet on their desk. So within a name tag, there should be an alphabet there. And I know some teachers want flexible seating as an example, but that alphabet strip has to be there. There's nothing worse than trying to support a student with their writing. And, this has happened to me numerous times where I go up to the student and we're working together and they figure out that they need the letter H for the H sound. And then they look up at me and say, what does an H look like? And then I'm looking around trying to find an H for them. It sounds like a very, very simple thing, but those nameplates with the alphabet are essential in our primary classrooms. Personal dictionaries also can be a very useful tool. In Alberta, it's even within our curriculum, it mentions them. And then, of course, the decodables, which I mentioned before. There's lots of different versions of them, and we can talk about those after if you're interested, but making sure our students have those resources as well. And then thinking about the resources that our teachers need. So if we have a teacher, hopefully we get to know our teachers well enough that they feel comfortable saying to us, you know what, I really struggle to teach writing. I don't know how to approach writing, or I'm not sure about phonics. Whatever it is that they're struggling with, then we need to figure out what we can do to support them. So getting them what it is they need. And I have lots of recommended resources within the book as well for each area. I target it for each area. Now, the other thing that I want just to mention here is those school-wide practices, right? Sometimes we do things because they've always been done that way, and we don't necessarily stop to think about, is this actually as effective as it could be, right? So thinking about these instructional practices, we want to make, these school-wide practices, we want to make sure we're valuing instructional time. So consider this to begin with. Do you have daily broadcasts or announcements for your students? Most schools do, whether it be daily. Most of the time I've encountered daily. Sometimes it's weekly, but most often daily. Are they at a consistent time? What time of day are they occurring? Usually first thing in the morning. Guess what? Language arts block. Have you ever had the opportunity to walk around and see what students are doing as they wait for broadcast or announcements to begin? It is very interesting to observe this because sometimes that is a lot of wasted instructional time. It depends on the teacher. It depends on how they structure that. But we need to think about this as a school-wide practice and how are we going to make this time most valuable for our students, right? It's not that we don't want them, but we want to make sure we're valuing the instructional time as well. Now, I had a school that I know that was doing school-wide multi-grade literacy groupings, 90 minutes every day, 3 blocks of 30 minutes for all of those kiddos. Now, what they were doing is they had the students rotate into these different groups. Now, again, if we were in person, I would ask you your specific thoughts. Here's what happened. At first glance, this plan looks okay, I can see the point. Well-intentioned. They're really trying to target skills. They're grouping students according to need, right? But what ended up happening is that the teachers didn't find that the time was valuable. Most of the time, they were not working with their own students, so they couldn't plan as well. They couldn't assess as effectively at all. And then we're also taking away that quality instructional time with their own students, 90 minutes a day. And again, it was during the language arts block. So there really wasn't time for a lot of explicit instruction or work with their own students. So what ended up happening is the teachers told me that instead of 3 30-minute blocks, it often ended up to be 3 20-minute blocks, 25-minute blocks, depending on the day, because of the transition time as well. So if we're thinking about a school-wide practice, we really have to think about, is it worth the time, right? So an effective practice, on the other hand, is 15 minutes of independent reading. And Robin Bright, who's also another Pembroke author, has said this: 15 minutes is magic. Carving out 15 minutes a day can make all the difference. That length of time is considered consequential, right? So when we're thinking about a school-wide practice we might want to implement, this would be an effective one. And Donalyn Miller, who I quoted earlier, has also said, the question can no longer be, how can we make time for independent reading? It's how can we not? We need to figure out how we're going to make this work within our schools. We can have the conversation with our teachers. What time of day is best? How do we make sure teachers are actually reading? What are students reading at this time? What specifically? And what are our teachers doing at that time, right? So thinking about all of this, you can see how those conversations with staff are going to really help make this time more valuable. The last little section that I just wanted to spend a moment on here are making your priorities visible. So when you're thinking about, people coming into your school, whether it be your students, whether it's your teachers, whether it's your parents, what do they notice in your school community? Now, part of that is going to be the school, the physical environment, right? So what already shows that we value literacy within our school, but what could we potentially add? We also want to think about, do teachers know that you as a literacy lead, that you as an assistant principal, that you as a principal, that you in whatever role you happen to be in, perhaps you're on a district level, do your teachers know that you are committed to improving literacy instruction? That should be something that is evident to them, right? And what about parents? Are your goals obvious to parents? And how are you going to make those goals obvious to parents? What about financial decisions? Do your financial decisions support literacy instruction? And right now, here's the time again when we're thinking about budget. So our financial decisions can be those resources, but it might also be thinking about our English language learners and our at-risk learners, especially if we're in a school that, maybe we're in a junior high school or a middle school. And again, literacy instruction is important there too. How are we spending our dollars to reflect that literacy instruction is important to us? And then ultimately staffing, right? Those decisions are also going to reflect your priorities. We started by saying literacy matters. So we know that your literacy leadership matters. And John Hattie has said, know thy impact. And I hope you go forth knowing how you can impact the literacy learning of the students in your school by the support you give to your teachers. Thank you for joining me today. I don't know if there were any questions in the chat there, Lionel. I didn't really have a chance to have a look.
You covered a lot of territory in about 50 minutes or so, so thank you. There were a couple comments in there. We do have a couple minutes, and I'll just remind folks that we also still have our lucky draw at the end. Yes. And just it'll be a quick plug as well for our session next week, building on what you're talking about. But there's a couple comments just at the start around sort of the ideas and the good ideas that were being provided within the book. Was that kind of the impetus for this? Because the focus is leadership, but very quickly you're into culture and both school and classroom and best practice and research based. I would think as a principal that's kind of trying to figure this all out and got all the pressures from everywhere, this is the kind of book that I can kind of be pulling where I need stuff from, even if I've got 20 or 30 years. Is that kind of a fair?
Absolutely. This book really did come from the questions I was getting when I was a consultant, and even since then. I was just finding that there were so many administrators who just didn't feel they had the background that they needed to lead their teachers in this area. Yeah. And so really trying to address some of those specific questions and provide that background. And who as an administrator has time to do the research themselves, right? Exactly. So giving that research and that foundation and then providing, the questions to go along with it. When I was a consultant, for principals, I did do the two pieces that I talked about at the end of every chapter. And I know that administrators really found them useful. That was some feedback I got and that was just informally as a consultant, I was doing that. And so I hope that they're useful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I noticed, there again, a comment in there around just the questions. And when I was looking at the ones you had shown us, it just seemed like if I was in a staff meeting, those would be golden to sort of take forward.
Absolutely.
Good. A couple other questions here. Pamela was asking and this sort of came up midway, and it was around the decodable books. And I thought it was a good question about, and this may be a longer one or maybe a shorter answer.
It's actually not too long. Yeah.
Okay. So at what reading level would you move from a decodable book to a trade book?
So typically the decodable books are intended for kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2. And so because they follow a scope and sequence, it's going to depend on the scope and sequence that teachers are using within the classroom. But that's really where the decodables are phonics, and they're using it immediately in their independent reading, and we can use them as part of our instruction as well, but it is for a very limited time. Now, the exception to that, if you do have struggling readers, consider using those decodable books with your older students who are struggling as well. Yeah. Now, one recommendation I have for that, you know, I don't have one within reach, but sometimes those older students don't want to use a decodable if it looks too young. You know, the look is important. You can access some decodable books digitally. That is a really great strategy for those older students, because they're finally able to use, you know, to practice their, you know, where they're at, but the other students don't see what they're reading. And so that can be a real, you know, benefit. So that's really where they're meant for.
Perfect. I really like that idea too, right? It's tough when you get older, you know, as you're moving forward. So Stacy had a question there as well. And I'm not sure, again, this might be something that she can reach out to you later as well. Can you recommend effective phonics and reading assessments?
So there is a book that I referenced earlier. This is How We Teach Reading and It Works. Mary, if you're here, can you make sure that is the correct title?
Just a sec. I have his other book here right now. Oh no, sorry, you're thinking that one. Yes, that's it.
Yeah, you know what you meant. And that one actually has it has phonics instruction within it, and it also has there's some screeners. That's the other piece, that when we're thinking about those primary classrooms, to do those screeners to help us understand where the gaps are with our students, or where they're at, even, and we can look at it that way, right? So that would be one that I would think about. And Stacey, if you're interested in reaching out to me further, I can, if you email me through my website, which is Words Change World.
There we are. Allison's got it there, Nicole.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, so it's
perfect. There we go. So that's one. And if you're interested in looking at more, feel free to contact me and I can send you something further.
Perfect. Good. Well, we're just about up at our time here, and maybe just before we do, I think folks are seeing there in the chat, there's a link to Heather's book around this is How We Teach Reading Instruction, and it's working. She will also be, Heather, along with Robin Bright and Elsbeth, will be on a reading panel next Thursday around research-informed literacy instruction, a panel discussion. And I put a link in the chat. I either copy and paste that in, and it'll take you right to the registration page. We would love to have you join us. Kind of a continuation, I think, of what Karen has been talking about in a lot of ways. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Pamela again was saying, and there was a hint, I think it's a hint to you, Karen, as well, as I would love to see a similar book written by you for teachers. This would be great for new teachers, for example. So I know in your free time, there's always for that. But
I did have a few teachers review this book as I was writing it, and I had a few administrators who said they want their teachers to read it. So that option is there.
Perfect. There we go. So just before we do go, folks, just a couple of sort of wrap it up things. Coming to your screen will be an offer. And it is, if you would like to go to the pembrokepublishers.com website, which you can get to when you finish the survey that comes right out at the end, and we would love for you to fill that out just to kind of give us a sense of what you would like to see next. It'll take you right to the website, and if you are looking for something, for example, Karen's book, you can put in the code LLM23, as in for Literacy Leadership Matters, and 23 for 2023, it will give you $5 off on your purchase. So that's available to you there. And finally, we just have a lucky draw, which we do at the end. And basically what will happen is it'll just go through everyone that's here and allow us to pull a name from. And now, of course, the system is just giving me a little bit of I'm going to see if I can do it here. There we go. Okay. Sorry, folks. I'm not quite sure why that's not going now. Okay, we will have to do a random. I'm sorry. I'm not sure. There's something. It's been one of those days, and it's not allowing me to pull the name out. Oh, maybe I've got here. Oh, shoot. Okay. So we will tomorrow, there will be an email coming out. We'll have a link to this particular recording. It will also have a link to register for tomorrow, or for next week as well. And also we'll list the winner of the lucky draw, which we'll have to do offline. And I apologize for that. But Karen, on behalf of everyone here, there's thank yous in the chat as well. Thank you so much for taking the last hour and covering a very topical issue, but kind of from an area of leadership that maybe not folks always get. And so it was really nice to have that frame on it as a leader within schools. So maybe just as we close out, I'll leave a last word for you, final thoughts, and then we'll say goodnight.
Thank you so much. Well, I do appreciate everyone's time tonight, and I think your dedication shows when you attend something to improve yourself, and I think that sends a message to your staff as well. So thank you so much. Thank you for all you do for your teachers and for your students. Take care, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you next week as well. Have a good evening.